In this case, the hard part isn't just what the Constitution requires. It's how much room federal judges have to second-guess what state courts already decided. That's the nuance here. Even if you think a trial should have gone differently, federal law sets a high bar before a federal court can step in and order a new trial. Klein v. Martin involves a state prisoner convicted of attempted murder. The dispute centers on a forensic computer report that was not turned over to the defense. The question is whether keeping that report back would have changed the outcome. The Supreme Court, in a short ruling, said the Fourth Circuit went too far when it granted federal habeas relief. The justices said the Fourth Circuit didn't give enough deference to the Maryland State Appellate Court under AEDPA, the federal law that limits when federal courts can undo state convictions. The Supreme Court said a fair-minded judge could reasonably decide the missing report would not have changed the verdict, given the strength of the other evidence. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dissented and said she would have denied the petition. Up next, what this tells us about how narrow federal review can be, even when evidence was not disclosed. Nine Robes uses nonpartisan, everyday language to focus on the facts of what the Supreme Court is saying. Here, you'll find clear, concise summaries of every Supreme Court opinion, stripped of legalese and clickbait headlines. Each post breaks down the facts, explains the court's reasoning, and highlights the crucial details that often go unnoticed. It's not just about what the court decided. It's about why those decisions matter, to give you a deeper understanding of the cases that define our nation's legal landscape. These summaries are generated by AI. Be careful and consult reputable sources when in doubt. Charles Brandon Martin was convicted in a Maryland state court for his role in the attempted murder of his pregnant girlfriend, Jodi Torok. The prosecution built their case on several pieces of evidence. They had DNA evidence linking Martin to a modified Gatorade bottle found at the crime scene, which prosecutors claimed was a homemade silencer. Witnesses testified they saw Martin at the location where this device was built. The prosecution also presented evidence that Martin had a motive. He wanted Torok to end her pregnancy. Finally, text messages showed that Martin knew where Torok would be on the day of the shooting. After his conviction, Martin challenged the verdict during state post-conviction proceedings. He argued that prosecutors had violated his constitutional rights by hiding important evidence. Specifically, the prosecution never disclosed a forensic report about a laptop Martin owned. This report showed the laptop contained no searches for terms like handgun or silencer. This mattered because a prosecution witness named Sherry Carter had testified that she saw Martin researching silencers on that very laptop. The Maryland Court of Special Appeals reviewed this claim and decided the hidden evidence was not important enough to have changed the verdict. They reasoned that even without Carter's testimony, plenty of other evidence pointed to Martin's guilt. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed with Maryland's decision and granted Martin relief. The Fourth Circuit believed Maryland had applied the wrong legal test when evaluating whether the hidden evidence mattered. The state of Maryland argued that the Fourth Circuit had failed to give proper respect to the state court's decision. Maryland contended that their appellate court had correctly applied the legal test for determining whether hidden evidence matters. They emphasized that substantial evidence connected Martin to the crime, even setting aside what Carter said about the laptop searches. Martin's side argued that the forensic report would have seriously damaged the prosecution's theory that the Gatorade bottle was a silencer. They believed this evidence could have cast the entire case in a different light and undermined confidence in the guilty verdict. The Supreme Court issued what's called a per curiam opinion. This is a unanimous ruling that doesn't identify which justice wrote it. The court summarily reversed the Fourth Circuit's decision. The Supreme Court held that the Fourth Circuit made two fundamental mistakes. First, the Fourth Circuit wrongly concluded that Maryland's appellate court had applied the wrong legal test. The Supreme Court emphasized that the state court had accurately summarized the relevant legal precedents, correctly stated the governing rule, and explicitly applied that rule to the facts of the case. The Fourth Circuit had criticized the state court's analysis for not being sufficiently detailed or for failing to discuss certain pieces of evidence. The Supreme Court said this criticism violated an important principle. Federal courts cannot impose their own standards for how state courts should write their opinions. Second, the Supreme Court found that the Fourth Circuit erred when it decided that no reasonable judge could agree with Maryland's conclusion. The Supreme Court pointed to the substantial evidence against Martin, his DNA on the bottle, eyewitness testimony from Michael Bradley about how the bottle was constructed, Martin's motive for wanting Torok harmed, his text message that established where Torok would be, his ownership of the right caliber weapon, and his suspicious behavior after the shooting. Even if the forensic report had completely destroyed Carter's credibility, a reasonable judge could still conclude that all this other evidence strongly supported the conviction. Justice Jackson noted that she would have denied the petition for review, but she provided no explanation for her position. This notation indicates disagreement with the court's decision to hear the case at all, not necessarily disagreement about who should win. Justices sometimes take this position when they believe a case does not warrant the Supreme Court's attention, perhaps because it involves applying settled law to specific facts rather than resolving a disagreement between different courts or addressing a novel legal question. This decision illustrates an important limitation on federal courts' power to overturn state court criminal convictions. Congress created this limitation through a law called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, or AEDPA. The critical legal distinction involves two different tests that might sound similar but work quite differently. One test asks, is there enough evidence remaining to support a conviction? This is called a sufficiency of the evidence test. The other test asks something more nuanced. Would the undisclosed evidence have put the whole case in such a different light as to undermine confidence in the verdict? This second test comes from a famous case called Brady v. Maryland, which established that prosecutors must share evidence that could help prove a defendant's innocence. The Fourth Circuit believed Maryland's court had confused these two tests. The Fourth Circuit thought Maryland was claiming to apply the Brady test while actually just asking whether enough evidence remained for conviction. The Supreme Court disagreed and found that Maryland followed the Brady standard correctly. But there's another layer of complexity here. AEDPA requires what courts call doubly deferential review. Under this law, federal courts cannot grant relief to a state prisoner merely because they would have decided the case differently. Instead, they must find that the state court's decision was contrary to clearly established federal law or involved an unreasonable application of that law. The Supreme Court has described this standard as protecting only against extreme failures in state court decision-making. The test asks whether any reasonable judge could have reached the state court's conclusion, not whether the federal court agrees with that conclusion. In practical terms, this means that even if the undisclosed forensic report might have changed the outcome of Martin's trial, federal habeas relief is unavailable unless no reasonable judge could conclude otherwise. The Supreme Court found plenty of room for reasonable disagreement in this case. Given the circumstantial but substantial evidence tying Martin to the modified bottle and the shooting, a reasonable judge could conclude that hiding the forensic report did not undermine confidence in the verdict. This case reinforces that federal courts must give considerable deference to state court decisions, even when reviewing claims that constitutional rights were violated. The system tolerates significant disagreement among judges about the right outcome, as long as the state court's decision falls within the range of reasonable interpretations of federal law. Find us online at 9robes.ai. That's the number 9robes.ai. Like and share this podcast with friends that like to be informed. 9 Robes provides AI summaries of U.S. Supreme Court cases. AI makes mistakes. People make mistakes too. We genuinely do our best to provide you with the most accurate summaries, but our best sometimes includes errors.